as for the man's record, I can't think of many positives that have come out of the Biden years. It's been a long, drawn-out embarrassment, the way that he was pushed into office, steered about, wheeled on and off, the way that things appear to have been done in his name, the way that he couldn't speak spontaneously, the way it basically degraded the United States and its democracy before the eyes of the world every time the guy stepped in front of a camera.
I want to talk about Joe Biden's health. This was a major issue. Actually, this has been a major issue for a long time. This isn't just going back to last year. But even in 2020, the Trump campaign were talking about Joe Biden's health. And there's been some new revelations in a book about his health. How do you assess this issue of whether Joe Biden was competent and able to be president over the last 4 years?
Well, Stephen, I feel like I'm heading back into time because I wasn't part of the Trump campaign. I had no great access to any information from the Democrats either. But in 2020 and 2021, I was regularly observing the fact that Joe Biden was clearly not the man he had been even a few years before, and was clearly not the kind of person who would be able to withstand the rigors of actually being president. So if I could see it simply by watching TV now and then, I very much doubt that the press corps who did have that kind of access were, as they now claim to be, unaware of it. It was always blatant. On the day of his inauguration in January 21, I wrote a piece called Welcome to the Harris Administration, in which I pointed out that Biden was clearly incapable, wasn't going to go the distance, and was effectively going to become a placeholder for Harris and whatever the Democrats had in mind in the longer term. And let's face it, they nearly pulled it off. If the 24 elections had gone the other way, we wouldn't be having this conversation now.
Interestingly enough, there's been a lot of news and discussion around Joe Biden's health in the last couple of weeks, partly because of a new book that's just come out, but also there's been some other books about this kind of thing as well in the last couple of months. But also Joe Biden's has put out a statement saying that he has cancer. He has prostate cancer. And this is just before this new book by Jake Tapper, Democratic or kind of liberal media anchor, has come out discussing some of the cover-ups, I suppose, of Joe Biden's health last year. So what do you make of this announcement that Joe Biden has cancer just before the book came out?
Well, I don't doubt that Biden has advanced prostate cancer. The timing of it, of course, suggests that it is an attempt to distract and damp down attention around the book. I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, but it seems to me that the President of the United States is probably under more medical surveillance than almost anyone on the planet. There are a handful of people who receive that degree of attention and that degree of quality medical care and attention. So I find it deeply implausible that he and the people around him were not aware that he had prostate cancer. I think this has probably gone on for a while, and I've no doubt that we will hear in the coming weeks at what point his circle and he as well were notified of this and chose not to talk about it. The wider issue, of course, is not specifically whether he was hiding a cancer diagnosis. I mean, FDR hid the fact that he was going around in a wheelchair. It's more that the cancer diagnosis distracts us from the serious historical question, which is just as FDR was able to function as a president despite being very sick and disabled, it seems to me that Joe Biden was not able to function as a president for most of his term. And for most of that period, in fact, until the last weeks when they panicked, the vast majority of American media, including CNN, which Jake Tapper, the biographer, works for, all of them were saying this was a vast right-wing conspiracy, that Biden has maybe lost a little pace but was basically great, and that there was nothing to see. And this, I'm afraid, fits a much wider and more serious pattern, which has gone on really since 2016, of much of the American media making a determined effort to misrepresent political reality in the United States and to render taboo the discussion of certain subjects. We saw this in the completely unsubstantiated so far campaign to claim that Donald Trump was a Russian agent. We saw this in the suppression of talk about the origins of COVID-19, and we saw it consistently through Biden's presidential term. I don't believe this is good for democracy. I don't believe it's a left-wing or right-wing or Democratic or Republican issue. Establishing the fundamental basic truths, for instance, is the president capable of fulfilling the executive role that the American people have elected him to? Without that, you cannot have a successfully functioning democracy, and you instead have a rapid decline, and this is what we have seen, a rapid decline of public trust, not just in the media, but also in the institutions of government.
Now, neither of us are doctors, so we can't speculate too much on this, but from my understanding of what I've read and what I've seen on TV, it's unlikely that Biden's prostate cancer diagnosis, as you say, it's unlikely that they didn't find out, some time ago that this is a sudden
days ago,
diagnosis.
For instance, yeah.
Yeah, days ago, exactly. But it's not totally impossible. I think there is, from my understanding, a chance, with these kind of cases that it can be a sudden diagnosis when it's this late, but it's unlikely. But going back to the media, because this was a really interesting, it really was a cover-up, wasn't it? Because we, as viewers, and also the American public and conservative media organizations in America could see these gaffes constantly occurring. Biden not only is making verbal gaffes, but he's also making kind of physical gaffes. He's tripping up on the stairs on Air Force One. He's walking in the wrong direction, after interviews and speeches. Jill Biden is having to kind of direct him constantly, even walking down like a stair. I don't know if you saw an interview.
Yes, I've been watching these things for years. It's been absurd and insulting to the intelligence to be told that it wasn't happening. But we were told that it wasn't happening. When Donald Trump went down a 45-degree ramp at some awards ceremony and skidded a bit, there were calls from most of the media for the 25th Amendment to be enacted immediately. And when Joe Biden fell on his face repeatedly on stages, on the stairs, and wandered off at summits, and generally just went AWOL whenever an open mic was in front of him, we were told this was not happening. We were not seeing it, and we were wicked or cracked in the head for the evidence of our own eyes. And it's not overstating it to say that a kind of soft totalitarianism is where you end up with if you have a system of media which is so powerful and unanimous in denying the reality that the public are seeing. That is a very powerful and dangerous instrument. And unfortunately, it has been deployed serially by the Democratic Party and by the media on behalf of the Democratic Party in the US in the last few years. And people talk about Pravda. It's worth noting that the journalists who worked for Pravda and Izvestia in the Soviet Union didn't just do it for their careers. They did it because they were too scared to do otherwise. In the free market of American media, people do it voluntarily. They do it for the team. They do it because they believe that the Democratic Party is or should be a sort of permanent one-party government, and therefore they're exerting their utmost to make sure that happens. And the very people who are now wringing their hands about how it happened and trying to find out who was really in charge are the people who have been doing their best to pull the wool over the American public, in fact the global public's eyes, for the last 4 to 5 years. And it was always transparent. And as I said, this is how a democracy comes apart. You cannot have a contaminated stream of information like this just being tipped into people's minds round the clock while the evidence of their eyes is being stigmatized and denied.
It's interesting that these books are suddenly coming out now after the 2024 election, after Joe Biden dropped out. And we can speculate as to why that is, but surely one reason is that Joe Biden represents no electoral future for the Democratic Party. Therefore, the stakes are very low for liberal media, for Democrat politicians to criticize Joe Biden, seeing he's not the president and there is no election campaign in which he, is running to be president. So do you think that is essentially why this is coming out now? I saw a headline in the New York Times the other day that read something like, "How did top Democrats miss Joe Biden's health failures?" Well, it's just, I saw that headline and I just laughed. It's unbelievable. We all knew what was going on.
Yeah. They didn't miss it. They just chose to say it wasn't happening, and to say that, if you believe, for instance, that, Hunter Biden's laptop was real, or some of it was for real, you were, quote, and this is Jake Tapper, who is now a defender of truth and so on, you were QAnoning, and that some of these things were too disgusting to be repeated and therefore should not be spoken about. As I said, this is one piece of a massive picture of misrepresentation and partisan deception. And you're right, it costs nothing now to make Biden the fall guy, just as it costs nothing now for Jake Tapper, as he has done, to announce that someone has told him that the effective, quote, chief of staff in the Biden White House was Hunter Biden, who everyone knows is a convicted felon with drug troubles and a pitiful as well as squalid figure. I mean, great, it costs nobody anything to say actually it was Hunter who was running the show. It's a very good question how it happened. The real questions, again, are not so much what was Hunter doing or what was Jill doing. It was, are the things which were done in the president's name, are we certain that all of those things were done in his name? The Xeroxed signature on all those orders and pardons, was he aware of that? I mean, it's standard to use a kind of printed type signature, that's one thing. Was he aware of the things which were being issued in his name? If not, it's a serious breach of executive power, and not just a matter of the media doing its usual terrible media thing. It would actually be a serious piece of damage to constitutional government. And I think we should direct our questions as much to that as towards the gossip aspect of who was doing it. To what degree did Biden's obvious impairment, when we're only going to have more stories about it in now the dam has been broken, the code of omerta has broken, to what degree did his impairment prevent him from carrying out his job? And then who was doing it, and in which particular aspects? Because, like I said, that is the genuine constitutional scandal that may well actually be missed out because we're talking about his cancer or about Hunter Biden and so on.
Well, it's worth mentioning Biden's family have kind of rallied around him in recent days and said that this book by Jake Tapper is a load of lies and nonsense. And Jill and other people have, they've gone on TV recently. Jill and Joe Biden, they went on to The View, and they were very much defending his legacy, again, saying that people who make these accusations about his health are just lying about it. And maybe you can comment on those recent interviews.
Well, I'm not a doctor, but I know the evidence in my eyes. It's dismal and corrupt, I'm afraid. And the entire Biden family appears to be profoundly cynical. As for the man's record, I can't think of many positives that have come out of the Biden years. It's been a long, drawn-out embarrassment, the way that he was pushed into office, steered about, wheeled on and off, the way that things appear to have been done in his name, the way that he couldn't speak spontaneously, the way it basically degraded the United States and its democracy before the eyes of the world every time the guy stepped in front of a camera. And so therefore it would be entirely consistent that as they leave the stage, the Bidens would claim that they're being misrepresented. It would be entirely consistent for them to be not telling the truth either, because that's what they've done all the way along. It's blatantly the case that the guy was too old for the job and got rapidly worse, and to the point that doctors were saying, I can't believe they've done this to him. It was, and as people are now calling it elder abuse. It was, but it was also the abuse of the trust of the American people, the abuse of America's allies who were forced to go along with this farce every time their leaders had to take a stage with Biden. It was extremely damaging to democracy, and I'm assuming that they will do their best to avoid any kind of blame for it, which it fits the pattern. They've not been straight at any point, so why would they tell us the truth now?
I remember watching some videos of Biden where he came across as a bit of a cuddly old man. There was one in particular where a guy was giving him a MAGA hat and he wore the MAGA hat, and it was quite a nice kind of cute moment. And you watch clips like that and there's a bit of warmth about the man. But then at the same time, he's got such a reputation, and not just in the last few years, but also, this is going back decades, bearing in mind he was first elected to the Senate in the 1970s, of his reputation basically being as a very nasty guy.
Well, there's two ways of looking at that. I mean, he was at his peak a very skillful political operator, which means he was good at both the retail aspect of politics, of working the room and winning over voters, and also very good about at the kind of backroom nastiness and deal making and beltway stuff. And the tragedy of it is, and it's like when a champion boxer has financial troubles or something and gets back in the ring for another turn, and they've lost their timing and they've lost their speed, and they basically get taken to pieces, and wheeling out an impaired candidate in the full glare of modern media and social media was the equivalent of doing that. He was never up to it. It was cruel, and his inability to keep up with the pace was blatant, to the point that he tried to run, they tried to run him, and it simply fell apart. It couldn't have worked. And then we have the brief little fiasco of the Harris campaign and so on. The whole thing ended in disaster. It is, I suppose, a tragedy. I mean, I would feel a lot more sorry for the parties involved if, as I said, they hadn't done this at the expense of the trust of the American people and hadn't, on the way, done a great deal of damage to American democracy. I'm not really worried about the reputation of the media. Everyone hates the media, and with good reason. But people vote. They live in a society. They have a right to have their leaders represent them to the best of their abilities. Left or right, I don't care about that. And it's very clear, and it was clear in 2020, that Biden was not up to that. Whatever his abilities were best at, they were simply not on top form by that point. And if you compared even videos of him, 2008, 2012, when he was stumping with Obama, yes, he would interview Obama as Barack America and things like that, but apparently he'd always been a bit like that. The decline between then and 2020 was so remarkable that internet conspiracies claim that he'd been substituted for a third party. He hadn't. He'd just undergone what happens, unfortunately, to a great many people, which is they get old and they come apart. And to do that to somebody in public, whether he wanted to or not is another matter. For the people around him to have done that and to have clearly sought to monetize it, as Hunter Biden very clearly did, is shameful.
Yeah, anyone who's got grandparents in their 80s or 90s will know what it's like to be around people of that age, and they, frankly...
Much as I mean, my grandparents are no longer with me, but when they were of that vintage, I would not have trusted them to reverse a car, let alone, command the most powerful military in the world or conduct delicate diplomatic negotiations. I wouldn't even have wanted them to go outside on a cold day, let alone fly around the country to deliver stump speeches or something. And you could see it was a form of torture by the end. And people like in showbiz, they say, I want to die on stage and, I never want to stop. But, it's not very dignified for them, and it's not very pleasant for the audience. And as I keep saying, it's not just showbiz. It's not just a matter of images and pictures and stories and narratives. We're talking about 1/3 billion people who have chosen one leader over another to represent their best interests as a nation. And it's very clear that the Biden presidency from the beginning was unable to do that. And very clear, as it was all the way through, that every single person involved in it, including Kamala Harris, were totally part of it.
Let's talk briefly about the power of the presidency, because Brits who are watching this might not quite understand just how significant a president is compared to, say, the Prime Minister, and how much power is vested in the presidency. It's almost like a kind of king. That's how the Constitution was sort of laid out at the beginning. It's just an elected king, basically.
Yeah, the American president has been described as George III, but you can get rid of him every few years. The powers are extensive. Domestically, of course, they're very much limited by Congress because of, if the Congress doesn't give you the money, then that's that. But especially in foreign affairs, the president has a free hand. And given the state of the world now, this age of rapid and dangerous transition we're in, the last person you would want in charge is somebody who literally, on a good day, can only be at the desk between 10 and 4. You'll remember Hillary Clinton's campaign, when the phone goes in the middle of the night, who do you want to answer it? Well, who answered the phone when it went off in the middle of the night in the White House in the Biden years? I mean, Hunter, Jill, Kamala. I mean, the night watchman, who knows? So the other thing is, a big difference, I think, is this. It's been said the British Prime Minister never sleeps easily once he or she is actually Prime Minister. Because at any point, the Prime Minister can be voted out by their own party and sent to the backbenches. And as we've seen in recent years in Britain, at a time of great crisis, they just come and go like buses. They keep being thrown out. And I don't expect Keir Starmer, for instance, to last until 2029. Very hard, on the other hand, to get rid of an American president. Obviously, there's the example of Nixon. Hasn't really happened otherwise in living memory. And it didn't happen in the case of Donald Trump, despite being impeached twice. Probably won't happen if they try to impeach him again. And it didn't happen in the case of Joe Biden, though, as we know, the 25th Amendment allows for the fact that the president can be deposed if he's blatantly incapable. And again, he was blatantly incapable, but the Democrats in Congress wouldn't have voted for it. So they were dragged along with it. And I think this, not all of them were willing, certainly not now, are willing to cover for it or to go with it. There's a man called Dean Phillips, who's no longer in Congress, who was there for the Democrats, who has criticised in the last couple of days very sharply the political culture of a party which is about controlling its elected representatives to keep them on message, and generally showing a lack of respect for the voters, because it's the voters who elect those Congress people. It's not the president who appoints them. The president is supposed to be accountable to Congress. And so a party machinery that bullies Congress into line, again, it's not serving the national interest. It's serving the kind of interest that when the American system was being designed in the 1780s was discussed in the Federalist Papers, as factionalism. And factionalism in those days, and I think we see it in our time, certainly Britain and America and many other democratic countries, factionalism is the enemy of the national interest.
Do you think that the Republican Party has a similar issue, and conservative media outlets, with their own leadership, where they're not willing to tell the truth, say, about Trump and issues that he has? Is there a kind of cultish atmosphere around Trump? Maybe one example is this plane that he's just taken from Qatar, $400 million plane. A lot of people criticizing Trump for basically taking a bribe from Qatar. Do you think that the situation with Biden, if the parties had been flipped, would the Republicans and would the conservative media have been far more vocal in calling out their own guy if he was acting as Biden was?
Well, we may yet see that, as Trump is much older than he was the last time round, and he's into his 80s, and so we shall see. As regards the Qatari plane, it's almost impossible to understand how that could not be understood as a bribe more widely. Now, whether Trump understands it as that, I have no idea. The people who say he's a complete crook say that he will honour the deal and accept it as a bribe and act accordingly. But to my opinion, it just looks appalling regardless. I just, for the same reason as Biden stumbling around and talking nonsense looks appalling, this kind of thing is unbefitting the presidency. As for the Trump and the media, the smaller, because it is less numerically, it's less large. The right-wing media have got into a sort of bunker mentality where they've got to understand their position as one. They're always being lied about, so therefore we might as well do it as well. I don't think that's a good idea. There is a certain you're with us or against us atmosphere around Trump. And I think, I don't think he's going to run for a third term. I sincerely hope he doesn't. And therefore, very soon, we would actually have a similar reckoning. In 3 years' time, we would have a similar reckoning. Well, who basically put the interest of faction ahead of the interest of truth on the right? And this kind of terrible ping pong, it tends to define American politics and culture, and it's not good. So I don't think there's anything lost by independence in the media.
Final question, Woodro Wilson. So there is a precedent here, isn't there, of a president who was also incapacitated back in the 1920s. Does this in any way compare to Woodrow Wilson? I think he had a stroke and then his wife essentially took over his responsibility.
At one point, she had him locked up and wouldn't let anyone go near him. Who knows? We will hear all kinds of stories in the coming weeks about what went on in the White House. I will say there's a serious parallel here, which is you have two Democratic presidents, Wilson and Biden, under whose watch things went rapidly sideways. Wilson's failure to manage the aftermath of the First World War is critical, really, to the breakout of the Second World War. Biden's presidency was one in which people began to wonder if they were in the early stages of a Third World War. The last kind of person you want in charge at a time like this, who's meant to be leading, stabilizing institutions, a stabilizing force in the world, is someone who is incompetent and being managed and it applies both to Wilson and Biden, in an unconstitutional manner. Because it's all very well for normal people to be managed by their spouses. I'm often quite relieved, but you can't have the presidency run like that.